Good evening. My name is Alan Matisow. I'm the Associate Director of the Baker Institute, and this is going to be a special event. It will feature a conversation through video conference between the Honorable Henry A. Kissinger and Ambassador Edward Djerejian, who's the founding director of the Baker Institute. The subject of their conversation will be Dr. Kissinger's remarkable new book called On China. The conversation will last about 40 minutes, and then Dr. Kissinger has agreed to accept questions from the audience. So if you want to ask a question, please write your questions on the cards that have been furnished by your seat, and members of the staff will collect them as the program proceeds. At the end of the program, copies of Dr. Kissinger's book will be available for purchase, and each copy has been personally signed by Dr. Kissinger. So Ambassador Djerejian, it's your program.
Thank you very much, Alan, and I wish to welcome our audience in Houston to this special event. Thank you for coming. Secretary Kissinger, I bring you very warm greetings from your friend and colleague, Secretary Baker, and it's a personal pleasure and honor for me to host you once again at the Baker Institute. In fact, this is the fourth time that have graced our institute. Way back in the early years, you participated in our first international conference with Mikhail Gorbachev and other world leaders, including Chinese leaders, and you've been with us for the Baker Hall dedication when we dedicated our building in 1997. And then last year, you were our keynote speaker on the reestablishment of relations between the United States and China. And this event is the fourth one on the occasion of your new book on China. So we deeply appreciate the substantive contributions you've made to our policy forum. And thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Well, let me say how happy I am to be here. Jim Baker and I have known each other for 3 decades or more. I'm a great admirer of his. And we started a relationship on a stormy basis when he announced that I wouldn't be reappointed as Secretary of State.
I remember that.
But we've overcome this and have become good and friends, and I'm a huge admirer of his.
Great.
And thank you for giving me
It's reciprocal, I know. Well, Mr. Secretary, you've written an excellent, meaningful, and timely book on China, which I believe will inform public opinion on one of the central geopolitical challenges of the 21st century, the relationship between the United States and China. As I said, it could not be more timely. You state that as a senior U.S. official, carrier of messages, and a scholar, you have pursued your admiration of the Chinese people and culture, and concomitantly the building of peace from largely a United States perspective. You state that the relationship between China and the United States has become the central element in the quest of world peace and stability and global well-being. And you point out that American exceptionalism is missionary and China's exceptionalism is cultural, which I find very, very insightful in terms of the culture of both countries. So in this context and in summary form, how would you characterize the interaction of the United States and China since, of course, the advent of the People's Republic of China? But I don't want you to go into too much detail because I want people to buy your book.
Well, when the People's Republic was established with the victory of the communists in the Chinese Civil War, they took the position that they needed to really develop by themselves. And the United States still had a relationship with Taiwan, which it has continued. And so for about 25 years, there was a deadlock in the relationship. The Chinese insisted that they would not deal with us until Taiwan was turned over to China. We took the position that we would not deal with them unless they proclaimed a willingness to settle the Taiwan issue by peaceful means. And then, of course, there was the interlude of the Korean War, when China involved itself in that war, which lasted 3 years. So until 1971, there was, in effect, no contact between the two countries. When President Nixon assumed the presidency, he started with the intention of bringing China into the international system because we were locked in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. We were engaged in a war in Vietnam. And we thought that adding a new factor to the international equation would give us more flexibility and above all would give the American people the sense that their president and their administration had a concept for how to create a more global peace. So we then began exploring how to establish relationships, which turned out to be very difficult because the Chinese were undergoing what they called the Cultural Revolution,
Yes.
in which almost anybody in any key position was moved out of that position and sent to the countryside to work in the fields, and there was no ambassador stationed anywhere around the world. We tried to send a message through Romania, which was the most independent of the Soviet satellite states. But as it turned out, the Chinese didn't trust any communist. The Chinese tried to send a message to us with a journalist that we considered a fellow traveler. So we ignored his messages on the ground that that's what he was doing all along. But finally we established a contact through Pakistan. And I went via Pakistan to China.
Which was the beginning of the breakthrough.
Which was the beginning of the breakthrough. But there was so little contact of China with the outside world. It was a very underdeveloped country then.
Amazing.
We now know that before I went there, they suddenly found out I was coming on a Boeing 707, that they didn't have a ramp that would go reach the door of the 707 because they didn't have any American planes. And they didn't want to admit that they didn't have a ramp. So they constructed a new ramp
For your
and were praying that it would work properly by the time I arrived.
On your chapter in the book on the indestructible Deng Xiaoping, I found that a fascinating chapter. You talk about the task of a leader, and I found that very perspicacious, if I may quote it and then ask you for your comment. China, as the present-day economic superpower, is the legacy of Deng Xiaoping. It is not that he designed specific programs to accomplish his ends, rather he fulfilled the ultimate task of a leader, of taking his society from where it is to where it has never been. Societies operate by standards of average performance. They sustain themselves by practicing the familiar, but they progress through leaders with a vision of the necessary and the courage to undertake a course whose benefits at first reside largely in their vision. It's in my eyes, a beautiful statement of what leadership is. And in that context, in your incredible interactions with the Chinese leadership from Mao, Zhou Enlai, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and others, could you give us a comparative assessment of some of the top Chinese leaders that you dealt with in terms of their leadership capabilities?
Well, let me begin with Mao. I have to do it in the order or perhaps you might be interested. On my first secret trip to China,
Yes.
I must have been the only visitor ever to visit China who was hoping to God that he would not get to see Mao. And the reason was that I knew President Nixon wanted to be the first American
Of course.
to shake Mao's hand. And I knew it would be worth my life. And on the other hand, Mao was fairly eager to meet me,
Right.
but too proud to schedule the meeting. So he had instructed his people that if I asked for a meeting, to bring me immediately to it. And I never asked for the meeting. And I then met him 5 times afterwards.
It's funny.
Now, Mao was, of course, the man who made the revolution.
Yes.
Most revolutionaries have one idea, and once they win, they institutionalize this idea. But Mao's idea was revolution. So he was not satisfied with having won the civil war. He wanted to give his people a permanent revolutionary experience. And he was afraid that if it ever settled down, that a new Mandarin class would develop and that China would petrify as he saw it. And so there was a constant crisis. He was the author of the so-called Great Leap Forward, where in 3 years he wanted to move China from a very low industrial base to a European level of industry. And that created so much chaos that a terrible famine started, partly because he expressed his goals in terms of steel production. And in order to meet the goals, they were melting down plows and other metal instruments. And it is now estimated that as many as 40 million people died as a result of the Great Leap Forward. He had barely gotten through that when he started the Cultural Revolution, in which every key official practically was moved from his job to work in the countryside and with their whole families. So that produced enormous dislocation and suffering. At the same time, with all this revolutionary fervor, I think he was a strategic genius. He managed to take China, unify it, put it on the map, fight the United States in Korea, and all at colossal suffering, so that by our standards, these were horrible disasters. But he was a tremendous magnetic personality. He affected to be a philosopher, and by his standards he was a philosopher. So he would receive foreign visitors in what looked like a normal guest house, in a room that was like a library with books scattered all over the place. And unlike most heads of government, or indeed most diplomatic conversations, your opposite number says, I've got X number of points to make. And you make your point.
Yes.
You've done that 100 times. He wouldn't do that. He would start with a point, with a question, and then you'd make an answer that. Then he'd add an elaboration, and it would go back and forth like this. So it was a Socratic type of dialogue, interjected with sarcastic comments. In one of my very early meetings, my first meeting with him, he said, let me tell you something. Let me tell you a story, he said. The Romanian Prime Minister came here and told me and appealed to me that you're a communist country, Soviets are a communist country. It won't do for you to quarrel. And he said, no, it doesn't matter. He said, I fight them for 10,000 years. So the Romanian kept appealing. And he said, in consideration of your trip, I'll take off 1,000 years. We'll fight 9,000 years. And this went on until he was down to 7,000 years. And at that point, he claims to have said, I've made my last concession. And then he turned to me and said, you see, I will be easy to get along with. Every time I make a concession, it's for 1,000 years. But what he was really telling me was, watch out. You get into a fight with me and it will never end. So he was a demonic figure who sort of let you know at the beginning that you were in a struggle. Elegantly phrased. Joe and I was different. He was elegant in his manners. He was considerate in his concerns. He didn't make you feel that you were in a permanent struggle. Of course, he was also a devout communist. Though at the very end of his life, like all number two men in China, he was destroyed by Mao anyway. But of the Chinese leaders, he was the most pleasant to deal with, enormously competent, but from a number two position.
Yes.
He did not give you the sense that he could take over with the Deng came in later. Deng, actually, when I went to China, he was out in the countryside working in a tractor factory, and he had been number 3 in China, and they purged him, mistreated his son, threw him from out of a window, so that he's even today a paraplegic. And so after 4 years of that, Mao pulled him back to Beijing and made him vice premier, really with a view of replacing Zhou Enlai. So here is this man coming out of this tragedy in his life. He was a little man, tough, to the point, spittoon in front of him, which he used frequently. No nonsense, he had no time for philosophical expositions. So at the beginning it was easy to underestimate him, particularly if you were used to Zhou. But it turned out that he was a great reformer. And even while Mao was still alive, he began introducing elements of market into the Chinese economy. And what Mao was trying to do by compulsion, he was trying to do by liberating the energies of the Chinese people. So, as a result, 2 years after he was brought back, he was purged again. And then Mao died, and then Deng brought about that reform, and those of us who saw China in the 70s, if anyone had showed us a picture of what China looks like today, we would have said that's inconceivable. And then came along a man, these 3 were tremendous figures. And then there was the Tiananmen Square uprising. And the party nearly split. And they got rid of the people running. And they brought in the mayor of Shanghai, Jiang Zemin, who was totally different in his demeanor. He spoke a lot of languages. He liked to break into songs, and was easy to underestimate it. But he is the one who actually Deng conceived the program. But Jiang Zemin executed it. And he came in 89, and by the time he left in 2002, China was a member of the WTO. And we forget this today. Even through the 90s, China's principal preoccupation was dealing with the United States. At first it was fear of Russia, then now it's become a global country, and Jiang Zemin is the one who put them there, and now the current president is a more colorless figure. And next year they're going to change their top level again. The new man will come in. 70% of the top leadership of China will be replaced next year. And 50% of the provincial governors. And so when you look at China now, you see no political contest. But you just know that there is a hell of a fight going on for those seats in the top echelon, especially for the 9 members of the standing committee, which is like the executive committee.
Fascinating. Deng's vision of economic liberalization and not including a significant move toward political liberalization is a sentence from your book. And I think that captures the issue of the whole challenge of economic liberalization in China and political openings. He, as you state in your book, argued that if there was too much of a move toward political liberalization, concomitant with the economic liberalization, it could be anarchy, and that anarchy had to be avoided at all costs.
Right.
Is this still the mindset of the Communist Party and leadership today?
There are 3 levels of this. First of all, there's Chinese history. China has always had a larger population than any other country in the world. And when you have to govern now 1.5 billion people that are, on the one hand, submissive for a period, but also very individualistic, there's always the sense that if they're not held together, there's no telling what will occur. And several periods of Chinese history, chaotic conditions resulted. So that's the historical memory. And secondly, it's the proclivity of the Communist Party in general,
Right.
to believe that there is only one true faith. And so they don't believe in pluralistic political systems as a party. And now thirdly, the communist ideology as a governing ideology has diminished. But the idea that of a one-party state has remained. And now the Communist Party in China is a lot like the PRI used to be in Mexico before the democratic reforms. But I believe, and Deng, who had huge imagination about market economics, on political reform, he was split. He was willing to grant a considerable measure of freedom of discussion on any issue except who governed the country. And in the long run, that's not tenable.
The Chinese Communist Party's stated goal, if I understand it correctly, is to assure a stable internal and external environment in order to promote and achieve China's economic and social development goals. That's one of their goals. If this is true, it would seem to me to open up opportunities for U.S.-Chinese relations to search for common ground. And I was struck by your reference to President Nixon's memo. I never knew about this memo to President Reagan in 1982, where at that period, when the Soviet Union was still a major equation in U.S.-Chinese relations, as you well point out in your book, that he stated the major unifying factor which will draw us closer together in the next decade could well be our economic interdependence. Rather a prescient statement in 82. I mean, really, it's very significant. So, in terms of these factors, and you mentioned your colleague, Secretary Schultz, who said that relations with China should be on a basis of strict reciprocity, common projects and a joint interest. Is this the way forward?
Well, as an objective, it's the way forward. But one has to understand there are a number of important differences. Our history is relatively short as a country. And we have had the good fortune that problems we recognize as problems proved soluble. So when America is confronted with a challenge, it looks at the element that produces the difficulty and comes up with a solution. And then we think, that's done, let's go on to something else. The Chinese have a 2,000-year, at least, or 4,000 years, depending how you count, a long history. And their basic belief is that the solution of a problem is the admissions ticket for another problem. So they never think that a process is completed. Secondly, as you know from your own experience in government, we should, as I said before, segment the issue. The Chinese have a word for which there's no English translation. It's pronounced shu. And what it means is, to deal with a problem, you have to understand all the elements that have a propensity to affect it, plus the momentum they confer to it. And the strategist is a man who can hold all these ideas together in his mind and give it motion. So, for example, in 2009, we sold arms to Taiwan. The president saw the Dalai Lama, and we raised the currency exchange problem. You know from your governmental experience that this was done by 3 separate decisions. The Chinese looked at it and said, this proves the Americans are launching a broad-scale attack, which wasn't true. So this is a problem. Still, the fact remains that when you look at all the issues around the world, if we and China don't deal with them together in the economic field, what takes cyberspace, which we read about,
A real current issue.
which is a huge current issue. It requires common efforts, and economic management requires common effort.
Absolutely. Your chapter on Tiananmen Square is equally fascinating, and you, in the previous chapter, you do a prelude to it, and you state, this is on the chapter on President Reagan and the advent of normalcy, you state, on the popular level, economic reform had raised Chinese expectations about living standards and personal liberties, while at the same time creating tensions and inequities that many Chinese felt could only be redressed by a more open and participatory political system. And then you go into this fascinating insights into how President George Herbert Walker Bush handled Tiananmen, and this unique personal correspondence between him and Deng Xiaoping. And you quote from President Bush's personal note, and I just want to repeat this one sentence. The question for me was how to condemn what we saw as wrong and react appropriately while also remaining engaged with China, even if the relationship must now be on hold. Do you see this Bush letter to Deng Xiaoping as a prime example of the merits of personal diplomacy?
Yes, and of the merits of engagement.
Exactly.
Because those of us who knew China in the 70s, and after Bush had been head of our liaison office in Beijing for
Right.
2 or 3 years, we thought of Deng as a reformer.
Yes.
We compared what Deng had done with what Mao had done, and we saw the progress that China had made. Then Deng got into a corner and reacted by our standards much too violently and excessively. But Bush, and strongly supported by people like me,
Right.
and of course Baker was Secretary of State at the time, tried to take care of both expressing our concerns, but leaving open the option of bringing China back into the international system. And I think they deserve tremendous credit for doing this, because if the relationship had deteriorated, it would have had no impact on the domestic situation. And every country around Asia would have had to choose between China and America. It would have created a very difficult state of affairs.
But you see in this letter and in Tiananmen Square the balance that we have to pay such attention to between a nation's values and principles and its national security interests. And we can see that even today. I don't know if this is an analogy to be made, but in the so-called Arab awakening in Tahrir Square, we have to balance our interests, our values, freedom, with our national security interests.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because we see that in the Gulf.
Yes.
We see that around the issue of Bahrain.
Yes, exactly.
Because, yes, we are for democracy. But also, if Iran takes over in the Gulf, it would have a cataclysmic impact on our economy, our security situation. And those objectives have to be kept together. So, yes, we are in favor of democracy, but we're not in favor of having a theocratic regime take over the region.
Exactly. So at the end of your book, you mentioned that, I don't know if it's pronounced the Crow Memorandum or the Crow Memorandum and the rise of Germany. This memorandum that this British official wrote in 1907, which basically his assessment that conflict was inherent because of the rise of Germany. That conflict between Germany and England was simply inherent because of its capabilities in its building a navy. And then you referred to the American version of the Crow Memorandum in political circles in our country that basically conclude that because of China's rising capabilities, conflict is inherent in the relationship.
Well, of course, what made the German rights produce an unavoidable conflict was that they had the largest land army, and then they were building a navy to rival Britain's.
Right.
And both of these things, that meant that they would be aiming for world domination.
Right.
Now, the problem with China is some rights and their capability is inherent in their economy. But the challenge we now have is, can our two countries develop a relationship that avoids getting to the point that Britain and Germany did. And I raised this question, had the leaders of Europe in 1907 known what the world would look like in 1919, right after the war, would they ever have done it?
That's a very good
I
question.
doubt it.
I doubt it too.
And they would have looked for means to find a solution. But we know what the world will look like if it heads into a total confrontation. And also we have a number of problems which are really global problems and which will run wild if there is no cooperation between the strongest nations. So that's the new aspect of the international situation.
Extrapolating on that, in one of your earlier chapters about Chinese culture and realpolitik, you mentioned, of course, the famous Sun Tzu's Art of War, that he articulates a doctrine less of territorial conquest than of psychological dominance, which has a deeper meaning of China's abandonment of its naval tradition. As you know, this is a big issue today that comes up. Is China no longer going to view the sea as a limit, or will it become like America did, looking at the sea as an expansionary highway?
It's a big question. Will the Chinese stop in their naval deployment, say, at the Marianas in the
Right.
chain of islands, or will they try to push towards Hawaii and the West Coast? And that will be a test.
That will be a test. My last question, just this concept of co-evolution that you state in the book, it's basically constructive engagement, but the two powers of the 21st century co-evolving.
Well, we have to understand one thing. If we don't stay competitive, no great theories that people like me can even develop will have any operational significance. We cannot ask the Chinese to solve our own internal problems. In my observation, the biggest single setback in our relations with China was the financial and economic crisis that started here in 2007. Until then, the Chinese thought, well, yes, we may have differences on political objectives, but they're manageable. But they thought that the United States knew how to run the financial system, and they were willing to subordinate themselves to it. Now they've lost that belief. And so if we do not become competitive, if we don't clean up our own internal situation, then no great theory of Chinese partnership can work. But assuming we do what we've always done, pull ourselves together, then I think we evolve in our direction, they evolve in theirs, but we make sure that we are in enough consultation so that we know how to manage potential disagreements, and in some cases find common objectives like environment, may even be on energy, and certainly in such things as cyberspace and nuclear proliferation. That is my basic view of it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kissinger. We're now going to turn to Dr. Alan Matisow and our audience at the Baker Institute in Houston. Alan, do you want to pose some of the questions, please?
Dr. Kissinger, several of the questions that have been presented relate to the same general issue. Given the tremendous problems that the Chinese face, including inefficient state industries, seething rural discontent, the threat of inflation, pervasive corruption, environmental degradation, and lack of ideological legitimacy, may we in fact be facing a regime that is losing the mandate of heaven rather than a rising power that is potentially a threat?
It's a very good question. you project trends of the last 30 years, you have to say we're dealing with the rising power. If you were to put together all the dangers that you mentioned from a Chinese point of view, the demographic decline, the need to deal with the millions of refugees, not so much refugees, but people who move from the countryside into the cities, and all the other factors that you mentioned, you can construct a potential for an enormous Chinese crisis. If that were to occur, that would set up its own set of waves around the world. I would say at this moment the answer to your question is uncertain. If you look at their current performance, you'd have to say it's likely that they will continue to hold together, but it seems inconceivable to me that they can continue to grow at a rate of 8 to 10% a year. Nobody has ever done that. And as their base increases, the complexities increase, and in a very short time, as you measure those things, the demographic problem is going to kick in, because the one-child family will produce a situation where in about 20 years, the labor force will start constantly to decline, and a larger and larger percentage of the population will be above 50, and will have to be, as they get older, supported by a shrinking percentage of younger people. And in fact, the demographic balance is worse in China than in any other country in the world.
Thank you. The next question, Alan?
The next question is, in your book, you posit the possibility of a harmonious future relationship with China. In what ways does Chinese behavior now pose real problems and threats to American interests?
Well, on the last page of my book, I admit it's a long march to get there. I point out that if you look at this relationship from a historical perspective, then the prospect of a harmonious outcome is not very great. But I also think we're living in a totally unprecedented world. And so there is a rational case to be made for the need to take an unprecedented look at the situation. The danger is that with ideology declining, that nationalism takes its place. And another danger is that as they grow in strength, the temptation to flaunt their strengths will be hard to resist. So that if the question is, what do I observe that is not compatible with the harmonious world, I would look at the behavior in the South China Sea, the way they react to territorial disputes on the various islands around their coast. And so what I'm trying to do in this book is to explain how Chinese and American thinking interact, and also how it differs. And when I speak of a harmonious relationship, it's as a goal we both have to set. We can't do it alone and shouldn't do it alone. Right now, in the phase of Chinese discussion. They went through, right after the financial crisis, a year of very challenging rhetoric and very challenging policies. They seem to have taken another look at that and seen that a confrontation with the United States, even politically, is something that's also very dangerous for them. So in the current phase of their relationship, they are proposing cooperative measures. But I believe in President Reagan's phrase, in which that verifying is a key element of any relationship.
Trust but verify.
Trust but verify.
Right. Thank you. Next question, Alan.
Would you agree that the most likely source of future conflict between the U.S. and the People's Republic is competition for scarce natural resources?
Well, actually I don't, because that's one we know. And that's one we will really, if it is possible to reach agreement on anything, that should be one we can solve. What I think the greatest danger of conflict is a place like Korea or Afghanistan after we withdraw, a place where something happens that's unexpected, that forces both sides to push in chips, and where they don't know what the other one is doing because they haven't fully prepared for it. Yes, we're going to have a conflict on a competition for resources, and there'll be substantial disagreement. But we pretty well understand what that problem is. And as a country, we've been pretty good at protecting it. I think it's a problem area, but it's one we understand better than what happens if a revolution suddenly breaks out in a country that both consider of vital interest.
Next question, Alan.
Would you comment on China's policy toward Iran, its impact on its relations with the United States, and also its impact on the Middle East?
You have to understand, one has to understand that China has really entered foreign policy in our sense only in the last 10 years. In the first 30 years of our relationship, they were primarily concerned with the Soviet Union and then to come back from Yemen. So they do not have an elaborated view of a global system. And they have it all the less so because the idea of sovereign states never existed in China. China was the dominant country in its region. So they've developed a very self-centered approach to most international problems. And in Iran, they balance, they don't want nuclear weapons in Iran, but they're not willing to pay a big price for that because they want access to the oil. I don't think in the next period that I talked about that the next Chinese leadership can afford. I think Iran is, under its present leadership, is a threat to the stability of the region. And if it develops nuclear weapons, creates incalculable consequences, The Chinese actually supported our last sanctions, but they have not yet taken as broad a view of challenges as we would like, as they should do.
Next question, Alan.
In the past, you have identified decentralization as an important trend in Chinese politics. Do you see decentralization as increasing or decreasing in the future, and how will this affect U.S. policy toward China? Should we change our interaction with the Chinese Communist Party and government? It's a word I can't read, but you get the general idea.
Well, as I said in our previous discussion with Ed, there is always this undercurrent in China of fear of potential disintegration. And you have tension between the assertion of provinces to autonomy and the desire of the government exercise central control. I don't think we as a country are in a position to intervene in this process very much. In periods of governmental weakness in Beijing, historically the provinces became very powerful. I had a personal experience once while either at the beginning of the Deng period or at the end of the Mao period, but anyway, a long time, about 30 years ago, I came to a city in southern China called Kunming, and I saw two Boeing 737s parked on the airport. I asked the governor, this is at the height of communist control, I asked the governor what these planes were doing there. He said he had Boston. And I said, for what reason? He said, well, Kunming is halfway between Hong Kong and Bangkok, and the people of Kunming now, if they want to go to Bangkok, they have to go to Hong Kong. And so I'm starting an airline between Kunming and Bangkok. And I asked him, how are you doing that? He said, well, we pay our taxes, but we have a lot of resources that they don't account for in Beijing, and I use those and create currency. Well, in Russia, that would have been out of just thinking that thought. So there's always that tendency in China and in conducting economic activity. There are many businessmen, and maybe some in the audience, who have done very well in China by going to the provinces rather than to the central government. When I meet people like that, I always tell them, make sure the central government knows what you're doing, because someday they're just going to crack down.
Exactly.
And it gets very dangerous.
Next question, Alan.
Mr. Secretary, students of your diplomacy describe you as a realist, by which I think they mean that you see the international order as a competition of nation states for advantage relative to their competitors. If that is, in fact, your general approach, how does your attitude toward China conform to it? Is it consistent or not?
Well, I think any Secretary of State or anyone who practices foreign policy has to start with an analysis of the situation. If you do not get right what the elements of the situation are, your conclusions will be wrong too. What I basically believe, and I'll get to the answer of your question, on China. It's this. If you look at the world, I cannot imagine having peace unless there is some equilibrium. And in that sense, power and national strength plays a key role. Because if that doesn't exist, you're at the mercy of the most ruthless. On the other hand, power by itself is not enough. The countries and the people have to feel that the arrangement of power is just. Because if they don't think it's just, it has to be imposed. And then you're living under a dictatorship or under foreign rule. So how to strike that balance between legitimacy and equilibrium? That's the real task of a state. Now let me apply this to China. President Nixon comes into office in 1969. There is a war going on that was started by a different administration. We have 550,000 troops here. The country is divided. There are riots in the street, and there's a challenge to the belief that the presidency is seeking peace. The Soviet Union has just occupied Czechoslovakia. The Cold War is at its height. The Soviet Union is producing hundreds of missiles a year. And so, for realistic American reasons, Nixon decides, of course with my enthusiastic support, that he needs maneuvering room. Then we notice that there are clashes going on the Chinese-Soviet border. And we decide that this gives us an opportunity to see whether we can split China and the Soviet Union, which were until then still considered part of the same enterprise. So there's a conversation in the book where Nixon talks to our ambassador to Taipei, Taiwan, which was still recognized as the government of China, in which he says, I hate to do what I'll be obliged to do, but we have to count on the 800 million Chinese people, what role they will play in the world. So I think it was very realistic, the only realistic policy. And after all, 7 presidents after that have conducted essentially the same policy, no matter where they started.
Well, Dr. Kissinger, thank you very much for sharing your wisdom, your thoughts, and your unique insights. Again, I want to reiterate, I think you made a major contribution to public opinion understanding China relationship. And I just want you to give us, in ending, I'm going to ask you one last question, and I hope you'll give us this scoop. What is the title of your next book?
First of all, thank you all for coming. And I remember my visits to great warmth, and my visits to Texas with great pleasure because of the commitment to foreign policy and national security that seems to be so dominant. I write my books in longhand. I'm the despair of my grandchildren about computers. So usually when I finish a book, I can't even think of writing another one. But if you ask me in 6 months,
Okay.
I'll probably be starting on the project.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Pleasure to
Superb.
be here.
Very superb. Thank you.